last night, you would probably be pretty happy. But instead, it was Cam Thomas of the Nets sealing a 28-point comeback victory for Brooklyn to end the Knicks' first half of the season on a devastating note. What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Putback with Ian Begley live. I'm Chris Williamson alongside SNY NBA insider Ian Begley. We're joined by Sal Licata, who's all over SNY, as well as the overnight host on The Fan. And my guy, Kristian Winfield, covers the Nets and the NBA for the New York Daily News and appears on the Certified Buckets podcast with our good friend, Ashley Nicole Moss. And we are live on SNY's Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube pages, as well as streaming on SNY.TV. And as always, we tip things off with the baseline. And really, last night's loss really highlighted the Knicks' inability to close games, or at least to be able to handle teams that are missing a lot of star power, as the Nets are at the moment. Do you feel like the last three games were the absolute low point of the Knicks season?
I mean, listen, Chris, let's see what happens next Friday against Miami, because it seems like every night we are saying, oh, this is the worst loss of the year. This is it. I mean, the last three games have been awful, and it's obviously led to a lot of speculation about Tom Thibodeau's status. I reported last night that even before that net loss, there were people of influence within the Garden that had lost some confidence in Thibodeau's ability to get things turned around, to coach this team. So, if you want to say hot seat, I think the temperature's turned up a little bit. But yeah, these last three losses have been brutal. But let's hold off on declaring them the worst loss of the season, because let's see what happens after the break.
Right. It seems like there's just going to be more and more dreadful moments for Knicks fans unless they are able to do a 180. And Sal, do you believe from what you saw last night, that was really the low point of the season?
No, I go back to MLK Day week where the Knicks lost at home to the Hornets on MLK Day. Then they lost to the T-Wolves. And then after that, they got spanked by the Pelicans on, I believe, that Thursday. That, to me, was the low point of the season. That was a game where, the Knicks still had a chance, as far as I was concerned, to be a playoff team or a play-in team, and they lose at home to the Pelicans, which they could not have done. Randall, fighting with Fournier, frustrated with the crowd. To me, that was the point in the season where they reached the breaking point. Remember, this is pre-deadline, too. Something had to change from that moment on, and it just continued to get worse. They didn't do anything into the trade deadline. They've had, as Ian said, horrible loss after horrible loss after horrible loss. I'm numb to it now. I mean, losing. What'd you expect? Did you really think they were going to beat the Nets? I don't care if they get up 28 points. So the Knicks are a dreadful basketball team. They have been, but I look back to that date against the Pelicans in a game where they could have at least kind of saved their season for the moment, saying, all right, this is a game they have to win, they should win, and let's go from there. And they lost that game. Once they lost that game, that was it for me. That was the low point of their season.
Yeah, and it's funny, Eric. I guess it's really sad because there's so many areas and different points of the season where you can say, yeah, this was rock bottom, and it just seems like rock bottom keeps getting worse. But as far as the game, Kristian, do you believe last night's comeback was more of a Nets win, or just the Knicks crumbling like they have been doing recently?
Let me frame this for you. The Knicks did not lose to Kevin Durant. They did not lose to Kyrie Irving, to Ben Simmons, to Joe Harris. They lost to Steve Nash. This is a coach who has gotten some flack for his inability to make, his substitution patterns and what have you. But he gave a halftime speech that all the players said was the turning point. The Nets were down 21 at the half. And to lose to Steve Nash, who is still learning as a head coach, this is his first stint. And on top of that, to lose to a Nets team whose best player was Cam Thomas, a rookie who just lit it up. This is as bad as it gets. You had Madison Square Garden sounding like Barclays Center last night. That is not good. That is a terrible loss. It is a worse loss for the Knicks than it is a win for the Nets.
Absolutely. You got Spike in the guard, you got Tracy Morgan, all these stars, as they always are, and then you put out that performance when you have almost a 30-point lead. It's really inexcusable. No other way you can put it. But as always, make sure you write your questions into the comment section, no matter what platform you're watching on. We'll get to them throughout the show. And Ian, you kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but when it comes to Tom Thibodeau, is the hot seat, getting a lot hotter on him right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think you go by the past 5 days, and it's certainly warming up. I wrote it last night. I don't think that. I mean, I guess I should say this. I'd be a little bit surprised if the Knicks got rid of Tom Thibodeau during the season. I would assume that he at least gets the chance to coach this team with a healthy Derrick Rose, because we all saw last season how good the Knicks were with Rose. And I would assume that because of his relationship with team president Leon Rose, he gets a little bit of rope here to try to clean up the mess that is the Knicks right now. But listen, strange things happen in pro sports. The Knicks have an all-star break here, and it would be, a good time if you're going to make a coaching change to make that change, because you get the next person in place. You give them a few practices going into that game against the Heat next Friday. But I still would be a little bit surprised if they pulled the trigger and Tom Thibodeau was let go mid-season.
And I don't think it would be smart at all to, let him go midseason. He's earned the right, even though things have not been nearly as successful as they were last year. He's earned the right for at least getting through the season, if he doesn't come back for a third year. But Sal, where do you feel like more responsibility lies for this season's struggles? Tom Thibodeau and not the players, but the front office?
Well, I think it's everybody, but it does start to me with the roster. Now, to be fair, if we're going to give Tibbs credit last year, last year was the question, who deserves more credit for the Knicks turnaround, Julius Randle or Tom Thibodeau? And I think you can make legitimate arguments for both. So this year, those guys both deserve a lot of the blame, where who's to credit for the Knicks' complete fall from last year? It's got to be Thibodeau and Julius Randle at the top of the list, but ultimately comes down to the roster. And I'm not sure what's going on with the communication or lack thereof, or if those guys are working in unison like we thought, meaning Leon Rose and Tom Thibodeau, but something is clearly off, because you can't have Leon Rose putting together this roster of a bunch of young guys, the Knicks being out of it, and yet Tibbs is not giving these guys any minutes. That doesn't make any sense to me. They don't have a point guard on the roster outside of Miles McBride, and he can't get in the game. So I know that he's a young player, and I'm not saying I know more than Tibbs does, but I do know that the Knicks don't have a point guard. That's the roster that they assembled. Derrick Rose is hurt. Kemba Walker is washed. Alec Burks is not a point guard. I mean, you get the Knicks trying to force the issue. Emmanuel Quickley is not a point guard. So I look at the roster, and I don't know what it is. What does Obi Toppins fit exactly? Yeah, he's a nice player, but that was a huge mistake taking him over Halliburton when you know you needed the point guard anyway. So regardless if you liked Halliburton or not, you think, hey, you know what? Let me take my chances with a guy who could potentially be a point guard of the future, as opposed to a power forward who's got no fit on this. The Obi Toppin's a nice finisher in transition. What is his role? So, and they're led by a power forward in Julius Randle, who's not a good shooter. RJ Barrett, not a good shooter. In a league where it is built on shooters, they don't have any good shooters. So I look at the roster overall. They don't play defense the way they did last year. Their star players are underperforming. They don't call them a star player would be a stretch. They're not getting the young guys in. What are they doing? I look at that roster with no direction. I would probably blame Leon Rose more than I would Tibbs.
I just got two things to follow up here for Sal. One, you mentioned Obi Toppin, and it bears repeating. I think going into that season when they drafted Obi Toppin and his rookie season, I think Julius Randle was available for trades. The Knicks were talking to teams. Teams had told me that he was available at that point, and so I think the plan was drafting Toppin. And at some point, you move off of Randle, and so you don't have this overlap that you have now. And so this is something, obviously, the Knicks now have to deal with, Toppin and Randle. And also with regards to everybody being on the same page, right? That was one of the, selling points, talking points, whatever you want to say, to Leon Rose and Tom Thibodeau. The idea that they have this long-standing relationship, and, they'll disagree on certain things, but they should be able to work well together. The idea that management and coaching being mostly on the same page is so important to success in the NBA. There have been instances where I think there's been disagreements there, and you could chalk it up to healthy disagreements on decision making, but I don't. The things that you hear aren't necessarily healthy. They're more so, not that the organization is not functioning properly, and so that's just something to keep an eye on here as we move forward.
Let me hop in real quick. I mean, last year when the Knicks finished fourth, I don't think anyone expected that, and I feel like everyone. I feel like it's a wide agreement here that the Knicks overachieved last season. When you overachieve and you want to reach that level again, you have to make the necessary improvements to that roster. To Sal's point, Alec Burks, Evan Fournier, Kemba Walker, who's not the same player he used to be. That's not enough to move the needle. And then you're seeing all the other teams in the East starting to get stronger. Cleveland made the necessary improvements. All these other teams are legitimate in terms of their playoff hopes. The Knicks just didn't have enough, and you're supposed to go get that. You can't have Julius Randle running the one. I'm sorry, he cannot be your primary decision maker with the ball. And once that's where the offense starts running through, you start to see everybody else get stagnant. You're supposed to add another primary playmaker in there. They didn't do that, and this is where you are.
Yeah, and it's very disappointing, to the point of, excuse me, Julius Randle. Yeah, he cannot be the guy who's handling the ball most of the time. We saw, it worked, last year, but they have a new makeup this year, and it's just not a recipe for success. But Sam Candle's behind the scenes today. She said last night's game was brutal. And Kareem Grant is asking you, Ian, do you think Tibbs is playing the vets more to raise their value for the draft?
No, I don't think so. I think Thibodeau is playing the vets because he sees that as his best chance to win night in and night out, right? That's been his message, since he came here. He wants to put the team in best position to win on any given night. But something was interesting last night when Thibodeau was talking to the media after that game, and he said, we have a great young core here. We should be focusing on, their development. So he made it sound as if there could be a shift in philosophy here after the break where, as opposed to just playing the veterans and trying to win games every night, maybe the philosophy turns to let's play these young guys more and give them chances to develop in games. Thibodeau has had a quick hook with Obi Toppin and other young players outside of Quentin Grimes, but maybe there's a shift here after they come back from the break and you see young players get more minutes and get a chance to learn through their mistakes in game.
Here's where the shift needs to be. Get Julius Randle off the ball. I don't even call him Julius Randle anymore. That's Julius Handle. Because once he touches the ball, he's not getting off that thing. You guys need to, and maybe Derrick Rose coming back helps, right? I thought at the trade deadline, maybe the buyout market, you guys are able to get another point guard. Maybe DJ Augustine's a guy that you guys want to bring in. You need some help in that back court. And I don't know how that happens. I don't know how you move Julius Randle off the ball when you don't have a steady point guard out there directing the offense.
Well, those are two huge issues. They don't have a point guard. That's number one. The way that they're built, where Randall on the ball is their best option, that's a big problem, number two. And then Ian talked about it. Here's what I don't get about this Knicks team. It's one thing to go 20 games, 30 games. They continue through 50 games to do the same thing, and they expect a different result. They are running out there the same starting five. They're giving the same guys the same amount of minutes, and they think it's their best chance to win. Meanwhile, they continue to lose, and they lose in embarrassing fashion, blowing these big leads. So, yeah, it's been long overdue to go with the young core of players. And this is why, I kind of like Leon Rose for a little part of it. It's not Clay Anthony early or Frank Ntilikina or Kevin Knox. Some of the guys that he's drafted, with Emmanuel Quickly, he has shown at times he could be a player. You've seen it with Obi Toppin. There are some positives. Quentin Grimes has been a terrific player. But let's see what McBride can do. There's no point of running these useless veterans out there in a lost season. Figure out what these young guys can be moving forward. Let RJ be the star of the team. Figure out how you want to fit Randall in, if that's going to be the case, off the ball. So there's a lot they could do here in the remainder of the season. It should have been earlier on because they continue to do the same thing and they expect a different result. Meanwhile, the results have been the same, losing.
Yeah, that's the definition of insanity.
Right.
And I think all Knicks fans are with you there, because it's been absolutely frustrating to see them do the same thing over and over again and expect different results. But make sure to visit SNY.TV for more details from Ian on Tom Thibodeau's future, as well as the latest episode of Begley's Mailbag as he answers your questions. But Ian, you have some new reporting out about Thibs, right?
Yeah, I think the story just got posted to SNY.TV. A couple of things to mention here. What Sal mentioned earlier, the idea that these guys are not on the same page. And I know that William Wesley, in some of his conversations with Knick owner Jim Dolan, has laid blame, at least in part, to this season on Tom Thibodeau and the coaching. And so, that's interesting to me because obviously Wesley is a decision maker within the organization. He's right there underneath Leon Rose, maybe next to Leon Rose. And so the idea that he's talking to ownership, and at least part of his conversation with ownership is about Thibodeau and coaching being the reason for the team's struggles. It just doesn't sit well, I guess, and it doesn't align, I guess, with the idea that everybody's on the same page there. And so that's troubling if you're a Knicks fan. And also, I do know that Tom Thibodeau, you go back to the trade deadline, February 10th, I believe it was, after it was clear the Knicks were not going to make any moves, Thibodeau, I'm told, was upset. He was upset. He felt that, there could be moves to be made that could have improved the roster. So I guess the idea that he, was against moves, I don't know if anybody said that, but I don't think that's true as far as I know. So just a couple of things there where, it seems like there's fissures, fractures there. Now, listen, this could all be part of like healthy disagreements among decision makers, but just the way that it's kind of playing out, it doesn't seem to be that.
I don't understand why you guys didn't make any moves at the deadline. When you have such a glaring need as a starting point guard, and you're in a position now to where you could feasibly miss the playoffs after being fourth in the East, you'd think that, the urgency level to add some significant playmakers to the roster would be enough to make a move. But what happened there? Why do you guys think this team chose not to make any moves at the deadline?
Well, for me, I think they didn't find the perfect deal that they would get, right? I think sometimes, front offices are looking for that 10 out of 10 deal. And if it doesn't come, then they're like, we're not pulling anything, we're not just going to make a stopgap move that's going to, put us in the same place, a year or two down the line. But I'm curious, Sal, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I'm assuming that the Knicks front office realized, hey, there's no point of going out there and making a big acquisition. We're not that good. So I thought they did the right thing. The only thing I would have liked to have seen, forget about trying to help this team make the playoffs. They could, look, technically, and I think they're done and buried, but they technically could still make the play-in. So, and they would have been that way anyway, even if they, improved. And I know Derrick Rose will come back and RJ Barrett will come back and they'll still stink, but people at least believe that they could get in the play-in, which is fine. But I think they needed to look at that and say, we need to trim some of these useless veterans, Alec Burks, Kemba Walker. Even if you could, I don't care if you have to attach a pick to Fournier, get him out of here. Maybe Randall, if you want to change the direction of the team. I know that's a bigger move. So if that move wasn't there, especially once Sacramento made the decision to go get Sabonis as their big and move Halliburton and keep Fox, Sabonis is better than Randall. So you could understand why Sacramento did that. Then the Knicks are left sitting with Julius Randle. Then they need to figure out, okay, well, how are we going to trim some of the fat? Why is Burks getting minutes? What can we do with Fournier? What are we going to do with Kemba Walker? That is what I would have liked to have seen, as opposed to trying to add to make them a playoff team, because at best, the Knicks would have been a borderline top 6 team and realistically not do any damage anyway. So you might as well see what you got with some of the young players and just try to open up minutes for those guys by getting rid of some of the useless veterans.
Yeah, it's absolutely time, to give those young guys minutes and allow them to see what they have fully, not just give them short leashes. But Sal, what was your reaction, to the story that Ian just broke about, World Wide West really killing Thibs there?
Yeah, it's a problem. I don't like that. And who's World Wide West to be making these? What does he know about what's going on with the coaching? Enough. I don't want the middleman. And this is how the Knicks get into trouble here. Now you get somebody like World Wide West who's got his own issues. Now he's going to go and be an earpiece, toward Dolan, and then Dolan's going to maybe act out. And we've seen this vicious cycle over and over again. Here's what I know. Tom Thibodeau is a better coach than anything the Knicks have had in recent memory, probably dating back to Jeff Van Gundy. Now, it's not all his problem. Has he been great this year? No, and I'm curious to why the defense had such a fall off to last year. But for World Wide West to be going to Dolan and talking about things where it was supposed to be Rose and Thibs that had that tight relationship, that's a problem. And if you're asking me, who I trust more basketball-wise, World Wide West, Jim Dolan, Leon Rose, Tom Thibodeau, the answer is an obvious Tom Thibodeau. He's the one guy that you knew you got in there with the Knicks. You figured finally they're going to be stable. It's been an ugly year, but I don't like the inner workings there where it sounds like they're trying to maybe blame Thibodeau and save their own rear ends when Tibbs is the one who knows more about basketball. I would trust him to build a better team than I would anybody else in that front office.
Yeah, and the fact that these disagreements and these shots are being taken or being leaked out, through the media just tells me, it's not a healthy situation, because yes, the disagreements happen and there are going to be conflicts. But if you have a well-oiled machine, usually you're going to try to keep that in-house as much as possible. But Ian, how much influence, based on everything that Sal just said, how much influence does World Wide West have in the front office? And how does that dynamic work with Jim Dolan and Leon Rose?
Yeah, I mean, but my understanding is he has significant influence with what the Knicks do and don't do. And I mean, you would think that that was the case because he has that big title. I think he's executive vice president. So anybody that's at that point in the flow chart of an organization has significant say in how things go. As far as what his conversations with Jim Dolan might lead to or might not lead to, I wouldn't want to speculate there because I don't know. But just the idea that, a person with that much influence with the Knicks, is having those conversations, it seems to not bode well for Tom Thibodeau's future. Now, again, the ultimate decision here, I think, rests with Leon Rose. He's the team president. And so he will make the call, in conjunction with others like Wesley, and then it'll be, signed off on by Jim Dolan. Any big decision, I think that's how things would work. But Wesley certainly has a significant influence, as does Brock Aller. So we'll see where things go from here.
I thought those guys were supposed to make the Knicks cool. I mean, isn't that World Wide West's job to make the Knicks cool again and bring in some players? And they've become even more of an embarrassment. World Wide West is worried about getting Tibbs out of there. Leon Rose and West, they can't get a star player here. Nobody wants to go play for them. It's an embarrassment. Maybe they should focus on that as opposed to worrying about what Tibbs is doing with this team.
Hey, sorry. It was all good, right? Everybody high-fiving each other, got go New York, go. And now, it's really become a whole mess. But, I do want to, excuse me, I do want to touch on this. We haven't really heard from Leon Rose publicly in a while, but the leaks have been few and far between since they've taken over. So with that being said, are we starting to see some sort of dysfunction in the organization after a honeymoon period?
Listen, I mean, I could cite the report that we have about William Wesley and Jim Dolan. To me, that seems like dysfunction. It seems like an organization that's not functioning well. But I don't want to paint that broad of a brush because it's possible that somehow, some way these guys get on the same page and they make the right decisions going forward and they turn things around. I wrote that in the article. I mean, every decision from here on out made in the Leon Rose era is very critical to the future of this organization. There's pathways for them to get right and turn this thing around and get back on track to becoming a contending team in the Eastern Conference. But the way things have gone this year and where they are right now, heading into the All-Star break, every decision has to be right. And, any misstep, any decision that, does not go the way you think it is could really lead to bad things for this organization and this regime. So I think that's kind of the underlying theme here is it's a pivotal juncture for the Knicks in the Leon Rose era.
Chris, to your question, for a while, I was thinking that the Nets had replaced the Knicks as the dysfunctional team of New York City. When you consider Kyrie Irving being part-time, the James Harden drama, Kevin Durant injury, Steve Nash coaching, it just seemed like it was a dumpster fire loading in Brooklyn. But the Knicks never fail to disappoint you. I mean, how do they let this happen? 28 points, you blow it to a team whose best player on the floor is Patty Mills. And then on top of that, now you've got internal strife about whether you're going to keep a head coach who Tom Thibodeau, regardless of what happens this year, he's still one of the best head coaches in this NBA, right? And that, I don't think that's debatable. It's just a matter of, are you putting a roster around him that makes sense? And listen, you don't have a point guard out there on the floor. That is very important. If you don't have that guy, a point guard is an extension of the head coach on the floor. If you don't have that guy out there calling the shots and you're riding on Julius Randle to direct the offense, I mean, I don't know what you guys expected.
Yeah, it's not going to end well. I know that much. But Sal, we've seen a ton of coaching turnover over the last decade. So do you feel like the Knicks need to show that type of patience with who they've assembled in place?
Yes, but they won't. So there's two questions there, right? Will the Knicks show patience and keep Tom Thibodeau for at least another year and see this thing out? Or do should the Knicks keep Tom Thibodeau? And I think they should keep him. To Kristian's point, you look at what the Knicks have done here with Tibbs. They hired a real head coach for the first time in a while. And you look around the league, what are the other options? Now, I wouldn't mind Atkinson if they were to fire Tibbs and hire Atkinson and have him develop, because I love what he did with Brooklyn, develop some of these young players. That's different. If that's the direction they want to go, at least they're saying, okay, Tibbs is more of a guy who's going to take the team to the next level and maybe put them over the top. We're not even close, so we'd rather have a younger head coach like Atkinson who wants to draft and help draft and develop these players. Fine, but who are they going to get outside of that that's better than what Tibbs has done as a head coach? And why overreact where last year the guy's the coach of the year and now one bad year, oh, he's got to get fired? I think it's more with the inner workings of that dysfunctional franchise that has been a constant. Regardless of who's been there, it's been a constant for the last 20 plus years. And that is the biggest reason why this team has not been able to dig out of their mess forever. That's a problem. And if they fire Tibbs, it just keeps on going, that same vicious cycle.
Yeah, and the common thread in all of that is Mr. James Dolan.
Yeah.
It's very telling. Obviously things can change this season. Doesn't look that way, but they still have a whole half of a year to go to really turn this thing around and be respectable, even if they don't get into the playoffs. But Tom Thibodeau, obviously, as everybody's mentioned, is very skilled and a savvy head coach, great mind. But we know about his reputation that precedes him. Could that be pushing away star power from joining the team?
I would say that I would say this: the losing is going to be what's really pushing star power away from joining this Knick team. Tom Thibodeau, I can't tell you how individual players feel about him. I do know that, in this Knick locker room, there was some, disagreement, some disagreement and some friction between the players and the coach in the wake of the decision-making around Kemba Walker and how, he benched Kemba Walker, took him totally out of the rotation. The friction wasn't about basketball, though. It was about how, it was communicated. Walker and Thibodeau didn't really talk in the aftermath of the decision. And so the feeling among players was that wasn't really the right way to handle it. And also the idea that Kemba Walker could be benched and held accountable, but that same level of accountability, all players are not held to that same level. So, it caused a little bit of strife there. But as far as outside players, it's hard to say. It's up to that individual player. But I do think really the losing is what's going to hurt the Knicks. You need to show, if you're the Knicks, that you're a team that's ascendant with a young core, like the Nets did before landing Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant. That's important. And so now you're taking a step back, sideways, whatever it may be. That's really what's going to hurt you in terms of attracting outside talent.
I'll tell you what's going to also hurt you in terms of attracting outside talent. Having to play with Julius Randle. How is that going to work? Who are you going to bring in that's going to then say, okay, well, I've got to defer to Julius because he's been leading the show for so long. And that's really, for me, that's where a lot of this team's issues start. And I don't want to be the guy who's beating the trade Julius Randle horn, but I thought that's what they needed to do at the deadline, and they didn't do it. You need to have a free-flowing offense. And Julius Randle, I think we saw it happen in the Lakers game, that meltdown where in the first half, he's playing within the flow of the offense, and then in the second half, he just wants everything to run through him, and they blow a lead and lose in overtime. I mean, at a certain point, you got to push the big red button. And I think that time, if it wasn't the trade deadline, I think that time is coming this offseason.
Yeah. It also doesn't help that Julius Randle has been averaging like 37 and a half minutes, I believe, in the last 10 games where, he can start out great. And he's been playing pretty good recently. I think he had over 30 yesterday, but he doesn't have the gas, at the end of the day, when it's time for crunch time. And, that's something that you have to think about with Tibbs. But obviously, Ian brought up the fact that, the Brooklyn Nets, had a great thing going with Atkinson, developing players, and then they brought in Steve Nash, who KD wanted. So, Kristian, do you believe that Tibbs' reputation as a coach, after the first year or two is something that is pushing away star power, or star players like, we're not looking for that type of coach?
That's an interesting question, because I think we watched some of that play out in Minnesota, where he couldn't necessarily command those young guys in terms of Karl Anthony Towns and Andrew Wiggins. And, that team's success was really dictated by Jimmy Butler, who came in, led them to their first playoff appearance in I don't know how long, and then left. And then you saw it become a dumpster fire once again. So, I mean, there's enough blame to go around. And I don't know what the replacement coach does in terms of, like, if you hire Kenny Atkinson, I don't know if you're hiring Kenny Atkinson to try to recruit a star player. You're probably going to hire him to develop these young guys. But if you go get a guy like, I don't know, Phil Handy, maybe Phil Handy comes comes in, and now that's a guy who's like, okay, well, he's well. Players respect him. Players want to play for a guy like that. So yeah, in a way, maybe Tibbs's coaching style doesn't rub best with the younger generation of up and coming talent. But at the end of the day, you've got to have a product out there. Like Ian said, winning is going to be what dictates whether star players come here or not. And right now, the Knicks ain't winning very much.
Yeah, well, here's the problem. We've been down this road before with Fizdale. Oh, the Knicks are going to get Fizdale because he's got a great relationship with all these players from his Miami days. How many times are the Knicks going to go out there and chase and hire guys because they think it's going to bring them the superstars, only to fall flat on their face time and time and time again? Which is why I just want to hire the best head coach for the job, which is why finally, after they hired Tibbs, now I wanted Van Gundy. I'm partial because I grew up a 90s Knicks fan, so I wanted Van Gundy to come back, nostalgia, and I think he's great. But if it's not Van Gundy, the next best thing is Tibbs. The guy's an extension of him, who's an extension of Riley, back to the good old days. And now, after one great year, overachieving year, they finished the 4th seed. Nobody thought that would be possible. Now, after a miserable year, and by the way, it's miserable, but it is also relative because off of last year, it's a lot worse. Prior to that, this would be a good year. I mean, what were we expecting the Knicks to win last year? How many games? And I know it was a little bit of a shortened season, but you weren't expecting the Knicks to win many games. So they're kind of doing now what they were expected to be doing really last year. And it's a problem because of the success they had last year. We got duped. We wanted to believe in him and love him, even though we knew they overachieved. Still, it was exciting to see them be a 4th seed. This year, the way that they started, people were going nuts. The bing bongers out there going crazy. But the reality is they're not a good basketball team. They have a good head coach. I know that they have a good head coach. I don't know what the talent is on that team and how they're structured, if that's the right way. And if anything, I would say that it's not. So they can't be getting rid of the one thing that we know has had success in this league. Stick it out at least one more year, see how it goes. Hopefully they can bring in at least a point guard and maybe some players and then continue to grow and develop and head in a direction for a change, the right direction.
Yeah, they don't need to have a knee-jerk reaction. They need to preach patience and make sure that, they build a roster around Tibbs's philosophy that's going to give them a lot of success. But Ian, with your article, there's obviously so many rifts in this organization. How much of that rift can be traced back to the lack of movement at the deadline and Tibbs's response to that lack of movement?
My understanding as far as like the idea of William Wesley talking to Jim Dolan and in part saying that, Thibodeau's coaching is partially why we're in this bad way. I think that predated the deadline. But then, you look at Tom Thibodeau being upset after the deadline when he found out or when it was clear the Knicks were not going to do anything significant. That obviously also speaks to, a lack of alignment there. And I do think that, in healthy organizations, there's going to be disagreements, right? And when you come out, when you're winning, every decision looks pretty good at the end of the day, but that doesn't mean that there weren't disagreements among decision makers to get to that point. The problem is when you're losing and when you backslide and when things go awry, that disagreement is going to turn into something that could be worse. I mean, so, it could be, you could label it as dysfunction, but I think it would be different if the Knicks were winning. Since they're losing, it looks bad and it looks like there's friction there, there's tension there. And so we'll see how things proceed from here, but it's certainly not the sign of a perfectly functioning organization.
Yeah, and not a lot of hope on the horizon, as it seems right now. But be sure to visit SNY.TV for Ian's article on Worldwide West's rift with Tibbs. That's going to do it for this week's edition of the Putback. Our thanks to Kristian Winfield of the Daily News and Certified Buckets for his perspective. We appreciate you. Love to have you on again, my man. And thanks to my man, again, Sal Licata. Catch him on SNY and overnights on The Fan. Also, a shout out to Sal's dog, Maddox, in the background. Always love when dogs, interrupt.
I heard him storming down the stairs. I was like, uh-oh, this is not going to be burst right into the room. And
does your dog know how to open the door? I think it opened the door and left on its own. That was
a smart dog. Smart dog. But we will be back next Friday at noon to preview the second half as the Knicks tip off with the Miami Heat later that night. For Ian, I'm Chris. We'll see you next week.
Lay out a few more seconds.